Geometry, Chapter 1, Lesson 5. We're going to look at measuring segments. We'll probably have this chapter and this lesson divided into 3 videos, possibly 4, depending upon how long it takes us to get through each one of these. So let's go ahead and dive right in. There's 2 types of things we want to look at: how to determine segment lengths. So the first thing we want to look at in this lesson, what you should know by the end of the lesson, by the end of this video, is how do you figure out the length of a segment. Okay, if I just gave a segment here, remember, a segment is just a part of a line. So here I have a segment and I have 2 endpoints. Okay, and I asked you, what's the distance between these 2 points? What would you do? How could you do that? Now I know some of you probably, oh, you take a ruler and you measure it. Well, that's kind of thing, but you don't have that. I'm saying just with the information that you have right there on the screen, how would you determine the distance between those 2 points? And really, there's no way to determine the distance between those 2 points unless you do a couple of things. And those couple of things is bound up in what we call the ruler postulate. And again, a postulate is something we accept as true, even though we can't prove it. And I'm going to read it, but then I'm going to break it down because it really gets kind of complicated. But it really, when you come to something like this in mathematics, the tendency of most students is to read it, say, I don't get it, because you're trying to understand everything at once. You read that sentence and you go, I don't get any of it. But if we just break it down into its parts, that might help us understand it. And really, again, this is a skill that you have to learn and get better at as you're looking at reading textbooks, more technical textbooks, as you move forward in your education and you get into higher levels of math, higher levels of science, higher levels of history. You really have to slow down, break these sentences down into their pieces so that you can actually process the information. Because a sentence like we're about to read, there's just too much in there to try and get it in one just cursory reading of it. Okay, so let's break it down. First of all, it says the points of a line can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with the real numbers so that the distance between any 2 points is the absolute value of the difference of the corresponding numbers. Okay, what does all that mean? Basically, it breaks down to this. If I want to know the distance between those 2 points, the first thing I have to do is I have to give a number to each one of those points. Without a number, okay, then it's impossible to figure out the difference. So the first phrase there, the points of the lines can be put into one-to-one correspondence with the real numbers, means that I need to give each one of the points on the line a number. Once each one of those points has its own number, I can then actually figure out the distance between any of the 2 points. Okay, so one-to-one correspondence means each point, one point gets one number, and we're talking about real numbers, so we're talking about the numbers that we would normally use. Okay, real numbers. Okay, so that's what that first phrase means. Once I've done that, then it says the distance, so that the distance between any 2 points is, that means the distance can be calculated. How can it be calculated? By taking the absolute value of the difference. What does the word difference mean in math? Well, it means subtraction. So actually, I can take those 2 numbers that now each point has, I can subtract them, take the absolute value of that, and that's going to give me the distance. Okay? So for any number, generic number, I can take the number that goes with A, its coordinate, minus the number that goes with B, take the absolute value, that will give me the distance. That's how I can actually measure the distance between those 2 points. Okay, so what the ruler postulate boils down to is this: every point gets one number. Once that's done, the difference between those 2 numbers, take the absolute value, that will give me how far apart those numbers are. So what's the distance between 27 and 133? Okay, oh, sorry, one last thing. Because I'm taking the absolute value, and you should remember from absolute value that it always ends up being a positive number. That's because distance always ends up being positive. The order that I do the subtraction doesn't matter. I can do For instance, if we were trying to find the distance between 27 and 133, those 2 points, I could do 27 minus 133, which is going to give me a negative number, but I'm going to take the absolute value of that, so it ends up being positive, the length of the segment. Or if I did 133 minus 27, that number is positive, but take the absolute value of the positive, it still remains positive, so it gives me the distance positive. So as long as I take the absolute value, the order doesn't matter. Okay, so that's how we actually find the length between any two numbers or any 2 points. Okay, so the ruler postulate says as long as I put them in order, it's the basis for measurement, one number for each point, the distance is then the absolute value of a minus b. So really, out of that whole thing, this would be what would need to be in your notes right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and apply that on a problem or two. So here, I want to know the distance between A and B, A and C, all right? So each point gets a letter, or a number, excuse me, that's its coordinate. So the length of AB would simply be the absolute value of the difference between A and B. I want you to write this down. And here's the reason, the ruler postulate. This is the beginning of doing proofs, okay, which we're going to get to in chapter 3, I believe. Remember what I said in one of the videos earlier. Geometry is all about making a statement and then giving a reason. And every reason that you give must be a definition that you've learned, a postulate that you've learned, or a theorem that you've learned. In other words, the only reason I can write that the length of AB is equal to the absolute value of A minus B is because there's a definition that says that, there's a postulate that says that, or there's a theorem that says that. And the reason has to be one of those. And in a proof, which we'll do later, you make a statement, then you give a reason. You make a statement, then you give a reason. You make a statement, you give a reason. So you're going to begin doing that right now. Now remember, we just learned that the length of a segment is the absolute value of the difference between those two coordinates. The reason I can write this algebraic statement right here, that I can figure out the length of AB by taking the coordinate from A, subtracting the coordinate from B, taking the absolute value. The only reason I know that is because I know the ruler postulate. So this is true because of the ruler postulate. And basically, your geometry is done. That's geometry right there, is recognizing that how and the reason why this equation is true. Everything else that I do from here on out is algebra. I substitute in values for that, and then I solve for the variable that I don't have. So the geometry part is right here. So this is the most important part of the lesson for me, is being able to write the expression, write the equation that you would use to answer the question, and give me the reason. The rest of it is algebra, which you should already know, so that's important in arriving at the answer, but how you begin is everything. And that's what we're going to be looking at as we go through. So keep that in mind. The most important part of this whole course is being able to write an expression and give me the reason for why that expression is true. All right? Once I've done that, then I can go ahead, like I said, the rest is algebra. Putting 27 in for A, that's substitution, algebra. Putting 133 in for B, that's substitution, algebra. Now the rest is just calculating and doing algebra. You're not doing geometry anymore, you're doing algebra. So 27 minus 133 is a negative 106. The absolute value of negative 106 is 106. So the length of AB is 106. Okay? Geometry here, the rest is algebra. So this right here is the most important part to me. So this is what I'll be grading mostly on. What's the equation and what's the reason? Okay, so that is how you determine the lengths of segments. So that's going to end this video. Go ahead and check out some of the homework problems that have to do with finding those lengths, and then we'll see you in class.